I'm Alison Fraser, host of Women Who Podcast, the show for side hustling women who are ambitious but time limited. Each week, I bring you real life stories and actionable tips to help you create and grow your own podcast. In this episode, I speak with Kristin Fitch about the time she wanted to quit her podcast and what she did to maintain her show. Kristin is the host of Building a Life You Love and Faith Fueled Woman, and together she has created and published more than 400 episodes. You're also going to hear about the test podcast shows that she has on the go too. So stick around, especially if you're already thinking you should maybe stop publishing the podcast you already have. And if you're just starting out, how you can set yourself up to keep it going when that going gets tough. Kristin, when you feel like throwing in the towel, what have you done to get over that?
Yeah. So the first thing when I started my first podcast, I think I had already made a commitment to myself that I wanted to do it for 1 year, no matter what. Right. So the first thing is I went into it with a mindset that regardless if my numbers were teeny or they were big, like no matter what, I was going to do it for a year. And so the good news is for that first year, no matter what happened, I was committed to doing at least one episode a week. But you still can feel discouraged sometimes. So whether it was during that year or then beyond that, because now it's been 2 to 3 years, and I have 2 podcasts. So what makes it hard is when one of the stats are higher than the other, you're thinking, is this a waste? Should I be doing the second one? Or for some people, the first one? And so I just had to remind myself that we often want to compare ourselves to the really well-known people that maybe their podcasts either are 10 years old or they had a huge following in what they're doing already. And we want to compare ourselves to other people and their speed and journey. And so I have to remind myself, this isn't a competition. And if I even had 1 listener or 50 or 500 or it doesn't matter. It's that somebody listened and somebody took something from it. And so I put something of value in the world. And so it's really reminding myself of those little messages, I think, and just reminding myself, did I try to add value? Did I try to help somebody with the conversation or the content? And if I did that, then I did the job I needed to do. And so that helped me show up over and over again.
How close did you come to actually just quitting one or either of your podcasts?
So I've pivoted a lot. So the first thing I'd say to people is if you're feeling a little frustrated, a lot of times it's like any other business endeavor or side hustle endeavor. We have to keep kind of seeing, well, what might we need to change slightly, right? It could be your messaging. It could be what category you're in. And so I've tweaked a lot. So before I ever thought I'm going to quit, I've done a lot of editing, tweaking, kind of testing. And I still feel like it's an ongoing learning process, right? And so for me, I still, for one of my podcasts, wonder, okay, am I doing myself a disservice by having more than one? And actually a couple others I've tested because I'm being spread out, so that is a dialogue that goes on in my head. And I have to remind myself, I still find joy in doing multiple podcasts because I like multiple types of content. I like to talk about different things and they don't all fit in one category. And so for me, I've gotten close enough to thinking, should I put it on pause? So should I take a break over more than like 2 weeks or something for the holidays? Should I take a break and then see what happens if I would just focus on one? But I've not been willing to do it. So I've gotten as close as considering pausing it for a period of time, but I haven't done it yet.
Oh, well, kudos to you for keeping on going. Because I know in this day and age, there's a lot of quitting. Like you might start something and then just it's not working for whatever reason. Or, like people with diets go all in and then just quit, join the gym, go all in for a couple of weeks and then quit. So quitting is something that we're kind of used to. And it's so easy to stop. So yeah, it's good to have those tactics that you've used to not pull the pin.
Yeah. And actually I would just add something for anybody that's, either if they already have a podcast or they're still thinking about it. The stats on podcasting, for instance, is like there's 4.6 million active podcasts. And Apple, for instance, has 2.6 million of those podcasts on their platform in particular. Only 17% of those are active podcasts, to your point. So about 455,000 on the Apple platform are actually active, meaning that they haven't been abandoned or they only did one like test episode. They're not currently, active shows. And so the reason I say that, yes, some of us can be discouraged, like, oh my gosh, only that many. But the exciting thing is if you can figure it out, if you can be consistent, if you can be willing to not quit, even though it's a long game, right? If you can do that, then you're going to be in a small percentage of only 20% of podcasts that actually are willing to put in the work to stick it out and then actually make it successful.
I've heard it said it's 8 episodes that most podcasts stop at. So by doing 9, you're doing well.
That's exactly right. I think it says something like, I have that data point somewhere. Most shows are under only 38% of shows have over 10 episodes. So so most probably do quit between 3 and 8. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's where having a plan for your podcast and knowing the kind of content you want to produce really helps, because then you're not going to run out of ideas.
Right. Yeah. You at least have to have like, what are the categories? And one thing I think is people need to know, like, what truly is the problem or the challenge you're trying to help people with. And the more excited you are about it, either because you've had to deal with it yourself, of course, or it's your professional focus, the more we're going to be able to continue to have content because we're dealing with it, or we deal with it with our clients. And so that's always important, right? To be really clear on what are the main pillars you're going to focus on. It doesn't have to be one, but you do have to have an idea.
Yeah. You mentioned before you're testing out some other podcasts as well. So with all of the recording you're doing, do you have a set schedule to make sure that you don't miss an episode?
I have definitely, it's varied over time. So my best months, then yes. So I don't record usually with guests ever on Mondays and Fridays. It's usually Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays during set hours. And then usually I try to do my podcast editing in batches. So if I can do more than one episode, I do. But I don't have it like every Tuesday only am I doing, from these hours, that's when I give it. Because sometimes I don't have the mental space. Like I try to sit down for 5 or 6 hours doing a certain work, and I feel like it's not quite working. And so on occasion, I do have to alter when I work on it. But yes, in general, I do some batching, and then I do try to plan some stuff out. But there's other months, to be honest, because, right, that's the kind of show we're here. I do sometimes I have things scheduled out for 2 months, right? Podcast episodes. And sometimes I'm working week by week. So my year shifts. And so, if you have a big team and I don't right now, then that's easier to do. But when you're a one woman show, it is sometimes harder to be so meticulous and planned out. So don't be discouraged if that's you, because I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm somewhere in the middle.
That is encouraging to hear that, even though you have so many different things on the go, that you don't have it all figured out. Like
That's right.
We're supposed to have this all figured out, aren't we, before we do this podcast, apparently. But it's good that some of us just kind of wing it week to week, or as you say, in other times, you do have things set out. Yeah, it's just that ebb and flow.
Absolutely. You had asked me earlier about, that I had other shows that I have been testing out, other podcasts. And so, so I have one, my main one is Building a Life You Love. And that one is more just about helping women get unstuck and defining life on their terms and all of this sort of thing. And I have another podcast that's more of a faith-focused podcast to encourage women in their lives and their faith. But yes, I have tested other shows, and eventually I want to have a podcast network. And so some people would look at that and say, that's so crazy. Like, if you're not already exactly where you want to be with everything, why do you have other shows? But I'm a creative person. And so for me, these ideas I've had in my head for a long time are written down. It's exciting to me to test them. And I also do believe sometimes it's in the testing, it's in the trying, that something magical happens and you're like, this is even better than the one before. Do you know what I mean? So I try to be open to not just say, oh, I have to stay the course on this one idea without experimenting. And so that's why for me, that's important to do that on occasion.
I'm so glad I've got you on, Kristin, because I've got like all these ideas in my head. I have 2 podcasts at the moment, this one and another one called Scottish at Heart. I've got one that I want to start with another friend, and about 3 other ideas that are, just in a notebook. Who knows what will happen with them?
Yeah. And I think the thing is if you're going to test anything out, whether it's a podcast or some other idea, it's really like, if you have your primary one, that you're doing, just have that one be most consistent. And the other ones, like I've only done maybe 6 episodes for some of the other ones I've tested, and I'm not putting much effort in it, but it's allowed me to do the the intros and to pick the music and do some episodes and see how I liked it. But I don't have the time right now to really push all of those and do that many shows unless until I build a team. But for me, and it also lets me put it in marketplace so that it's there, right? Because that happens to other people. They have an idea for a year for a show. They never put it out there. And now that show name is taken. And yes, a lot of people have the same show names, but that's becoming that's a risk too, right? And so, if you have an idea and you really do think you might pursue it, it's never a bad idea, to get it out there as well.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about your dream is to have a podcast network. So what does that look like for you?
So I feel very strongly right now that in the world, there's a lot of just bad content, whether it's just dark or dreary or negative or all the things. And so for me, one of the things, I call myself an encourager. So one of the things for me that's super important for me to do, whether it's my work and then other people's, is to help us launch content that's inspirational, encouraging, adds value, and is uplifting. And so that's my vision for the podcast network.
Yeah. So to have a whole host of other podcasts that you help be successful, I guess.
Yeah. Originally, to start with would be my shows because I already know what the visions are. But yes, absolutely. Then it would hopefully be adding in other shows, or even those shows I started doesn't mean I have to continue them, right? It could spin off to someone else running them or, hosting them. Yeah.
Well, I can see that you are an encourager and quite uplifting, because just looking at you on the video, listeners, Kristin's in this beautiful, airy, very light room with a lovely yellow wall behind you, which is, I love that color yellow.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you have any advice that you would like to share with, any tips that you've picked up along the way for when you started your podcast that you can pass on to other podcasters?
Oh, absolutely. So I think one of the first important questions to ask yourself is, what's the goal of your podcast? And I'll clarify that a little bit because it's an amazing thing to start a podcast. But if your first goal in doing something new, whether it's a side thing or it's just a passion project or whether it's for a business, if you have to, for instance, if you need to make money first, a podcast often is more of a long game unless you already have a product and something to kind of connect it to. So I just tell people, what is your goal first? Because if your goal is I need to bring in X dollars, you might want to work on that piece first before you launch the podcast. So it just depends. You need to know what your goal is. But then I think it's remembering it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? Because it's like any other thing you're going to do for a long time. Can you envision yourself doing this for a year, 5 years? And even if you can't, I'm not saying don't start, but it's important to know that it's a consistent, pattern. Those are the people that are doing well, or the people that show up regularly in whatever they're doing. So with podcasting, it's no different. And then it's one step at a time. A lot of people feel overwhelmed because there's so many pieces before you understand it well. And I tell them, write everything down you think you have to do. And then pick the one thing, right, that you can do right now. None of that's going to stop you. Those other things. And those other things aren't going to go away necessarily, but they don't all have to get done. You can just do the one thing and then move on to the next thing. And I think that's important to remember. And then you need a cheerleader. So whether that's someone else that podcasts, whether you're in a group, right, of podcasters, whatever it might be, but you're going to have days where you feel like throwing in the towel or you're just not sure. And you need somebody that understands it's beyond like your best friend, because they may not really get this unless they're doing it too. And then I think it's just like you said before, we have to be clear on what content we're going to provide. And you can shift, but you do need to know that so that you can have lots of ideas around the area that you want to talk about. I think those are some of my biggest ones. And then just be realistic. If you don't have a following of any sort yet, and you're new at this, don't assume, okay, I'm going to get 1 million downloads in the first month, right? Like you may never get big like that. And that's okay, because to impact lives or to make money, for some people that maybe want more from you, you only need a small number of people. It's are you impacting that small group of people that you're helping or you're sharing information with?
Mm-hmm. Oh, those are all so good. Yeah. Awesome tips, really, especially with that whole thought about throwing in the towel because you haven't got 1 million downloads.
Yeah.
And having someone who's also within podcasting who you can talk to about how you're feeling. Because don't know about you, but most of my friends don't do podcasts. Some of them,
Right.
but a lot of them don't even listen to podcasts.
Yeah. Well, you're right. You're so right. None of my local friends, I have plenty of wonderful girlfriends. None of them have a podcast locally. So I have online friends and groups that I know that podcast, or they're just starting theirs, and so I encourage them if I'm further along in that and that sort of thing. But it makes a big difference because it can be scary doing anything new, especially if you've done nothing. I've worked in online for a long time, and so even before I had my podcast, I was involved in another podcast. So for people that are starting off with no knowledge other than I've listened to them before, it can be really intimidating. And I just encourage you can do it. Like you really can do this, but you just have to set your mind to it and know that you're going to have doubt, and that's okay. And you just keep moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great note to end it on. You're very encouraging, and lots of awesome tips for anyone who is thinking, is this really for me? Is it time to quit? And I would say it's probably not time to quit, but time to just reassess what you're doing with your podcast.
Absolutely. And if it's okay, I have a little 10 tips thing that I can send to people if they're interested in it for podcasting.
That would be awesome.
Wonderful. Well, they can or do you want me to share the link or just give it?
You tell us where to find it, and I can put that link in the show notes.
Okay. It's kristinfitch.com/podcast-tips. And that's just basically going to be my 10 best podcasting tips for new or, starting out podcasters.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kristin. It's been awesome to have you on and to hear about your vision for your podcast and testing new other podcasts. I think that's also a great tip to pass on to others who have all those other ideas in their head.
Right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our conversation, and I hope this helps some of your listeners.
If you're thinking about quitting, it's important to know that 1, this is completely normal. Lots of podcasters have had this thought and acted on it. And 2, sometimes you just need to course correct or remind yourself why you started your show in the first place. This show went on pause last year for a few months while I had a rethink. And who knows what this will look and sound like a year from now. The main thing is I'm growing and learning each and every week. That's all from me this week. If you have a question or a problem that you would like help with, you can email me at alison@alisonfraser.co. I'll have that email in the show notes just in case you are driving. There are no silly questions. You'd be amazed at the topics of conversation around podcasting. So again, if there's something that you are curious about, it's okay to send a question in and I'll answer that one anonymously. That's it from me this week. I'll speak to you again soon. You've been listening to Women Who Podcast, the podcast for women with something to say.